Hey Dad, you've been a funeral director now for 40 years, and I was wondering, during that 40 years, what have been some of the changes, good and bad?
So I think there's been a lot of changes in 40 years. Probably the two good ones and one bad one. So probably the two really good ones are, one, personalisation. We used to have these very prescripted traditional funerals, and they served their purpose in years gone by. They were about following a pattern, following a set pattern, so that people knew how to grieve and when to grieve. And some of those traditions got rote. You know, they got to the point that people were going, yeah, I went to the funeral for my nana, and then nothing was said about nana. So we started to really personalise. I'm talking nearly 40 years ago. We started to move into less church-based funerals. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but a lot of people went to church because that's where they were baptised, and that was it. It was the only connection. They didn't understand any of the traditions. It didn't make sense to them. So we started having celebrants come into the funeral industry, and they were very personalised. Funnily enough, we've seen perhaps a cycle of those celebrants now. Some of them are going back to having a set pattern of what they say, and it's not personalised again, even though it might sound like it is. So yes, move away not so much from church, but from those traditional set ways of doing things which were not personalised to something really personalised. Talked about that in a lot of the other videos. You know, things like having a casket that fits, not just a traditional solid mahogany that's polished, but something that's perhaps a little bit different and reflects that personality right through to every part of the service, with slideshows and videos and printed service sheets and family talking, not just one set tribute, and all those sorts of personal things. And I think the other thing that was not good in the past, but now is family involvement. You used to get kids that weren't allowed to go to funerals. I mean, it was terrible, and not expected to. Even the woman traditionally didn't go to the burial. I mean, that's just foreign in our culture now. So there was this real move when I started of those old English, probably mostly traditions, going out the window, as people said, well, actually, we don't want professional pallbearers like in England. We want the family to carry Dad. Why not? So we've seen these lovely changes where families have got involved. The thing the question about what I don't like in the funeral industry, which has changed, is that we've got to this point where we're always saying, what do you want for your funeral? You know, the me-centered society we live in. And I think that's wrong. We always used to say when I started, the funeral is not for the deceased, it's for the living. So the funeral should be for the living. What can we do to make people grieve well, mourn well? A really good example today, I had a family who weren't going to even come to anything, and at the last minute I convinced them to turn up. So mum and the two kids turned up. She'd got a little playlist on her phone. She brought a photo on a USB. There was only 3 of them. They stood around, they listened to music, they talked, they shared, they cried, they comforted each other, and they went away saying, this was fantastic. I'm glad we didn't have a funeral. And I'm going, you did, you just had one. So it's about family involvement. I think that's been a really positive thing. But not doing anything, you know, just because you avoid it doesn't actually stop the pain. And I think that's where we've got to change, and I think we can change as a culture, going back to, hey, we need to actually think about how we say goodbye, but not from a I want perspective, but from a group, a society, a family, what's good for the family.
What are some other examples that some people can do that might benefit them grieving rather than the I want?
Yeah, and I think the things that work are the things that work for you. So what we often say with a family when we get someone together and they say, this is what I want for my funeral, and even if they do want a funeral, they get prescriptive, we go, how about you just give a really general guideline and let the family fill in the blanks? Because it's the family participation. If the grandkids want to get up and say something, why not? You know, if a 3-year-old wants to just get up and say, I loved you, Granddad, why not? Yeah, let them do it. And writing messages, drawing on caskets, we've talked about that before. Just being able to be involved, whether it is as a pallbearer, as a speaker, as a graphic person drawing something on a casket, you know, whatever it is, have that opportunity to do something.
I can imagine a situation can get quite overwhelming when you're trying to plan it. Is there any advice someone can do to help figure out what might be good for them during the funeral?
Yes, I think the key again comes back to ask your family. We get people often coming in here who say, this is what I want, but I don't want to talk to my kids because they're a bit funny about it. No, do the opposite. Come and see us, make some notes, go back to your kids and say, would this help you in your grief? And most of them will say, oh, I don't want to talk about that now. But if you say, I want to talk about it, then they will have permission to actually share what might help them. Yeah.
What would you say is the most positive thing you've learned that helps people grieve during these?
I think in my 40 years, the most positive thing about funerals is not the whole, what are you wearing? What does it look like? What do you look like? People won't remember what you look like, whether you had a nice bright coloured tie on like this, They won't remember even, we're talking now, they won't even remember what you say. They might remember little bits, but what they will really remember is how you made them feel. And that's the key. If it feels right, if it sits right with you for your grief, if it helps you on your grief journey, if that made you feel right for moving forward, that's the key.
What about holiday periods?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things for grief during holiday periods that are different than normal grief, and I'll talk about that in the next video.